So in our Romans passage today, Paul opens us up to think about different ways that we can worship. That in this circumstance, our worship has more to do with our whole bodies being offered on an altar. And while we often like to work with that metaphor about offering our bodies and sacrificing ourselves, it's helpful that the Greek in here and what Paul is saying isn't just talking about our minds or our emotions. This is actually meant for us to think about the whole total package of who we are. Our minds, our bodies, our souls. This is meant to be a far more physical embodiment. And what Paul's asking us to do in Romans is offer everything that we are, 100%, everything that we do, and we are to give it to God as an offering. We place ourselves on an altar in order to be sacrificed. That is the way that we can worship. We hear verse 2 all the time. Don't be conformed by the world, but be renewed. Do something by the renewing of your minds. We hear that all the time, and we almost do exactly what I just did, right? We're like, I hear this all the time, and so I'm not going to pay a whole lot of attention to it. It sounds great, though. Like, I want to be renewed. I'd like to be transformed. And often, at least how it was when I was growing up, it was used as a way to not think about sinning, right? Like, the world is bad. The world does bad things. And so, in order to be better than the world and better than the sinful life around you, it's good to not be conformed to it, but instead be renewed. But I think Paul offers so much more than just a binary sinner or not sinner. That maybe this is a better way to think about how we could be in this time or at any time. And maybe a better way to think about it as opposed to sin or not sin may be an opportunity to repattern ourselves. How do we develop a different set of ways of doing things? Our pattern of life looks different. And how do we do that? Well, I think Paul gives us a path. The first thing Paul invites us to do is reestablish our intellect to prove God's will. Oftentimes, when we talk about God, we use a lot of words about emotion. We feel God. And this makes sense because God is so big, God is so out there, that oftentimes it's hard to even think about who God is. But God does give us intellect. God gives us our minds. And our Reformed heritage reminds us that that is such a gift. Keep in mind that our early Reformers, as they were responding to what was happening in the Catholic Church, had argued that what we needed from God was offered in the text, in the Word. And through our minds and understanding the text, we could have a new relationship with God. So everything that we have as members of the Reformed tradition, from John Calvin on, valued that not only can we use our hearts and we can use our hands, but we can use our minds in a way that help us understand who God is in the world. That's a gift. And too often we kind of dismiss as part of our understanding of who we are in worship. But Paul invites us instead that in order for us to understand where God is that we can pay attention to what's going on in the world. We can read the signs. We can get evidence. We can use our minds to test where God is, to prove that God is near us, to get a sense of what the discernment is of God's will. And that phrase about discernment means more about proving God. And it sounds strange to us, as if somehow the only way that we're going to understand God's will is if we put it to the test. In fact, we're told at times not to put God to the test. But I think this is less of a personal challenge, as in like, fight me, God, and more about what's going on in this world. What can I understand about who God is today? What God might be doing amongst us. This is especially important as we try to understand what it's like to not be patterned after the world. There are certain things that are going on around us that we would say to ourselves, boy, this doesn't make me think about who God might be. Maybe we ought to take that as a sign. Maybe we ought to explore what it is like to seek after God. So use our minds. Discern what's going on. The second thing Paul invites us to do is, in essence, keep calm and carry on. I think it's really easy to think highly of ourselves in certain times. And so what happens is we apply that kind of thinking into this text here too. It's like, don't think too highly of yourselves as opposed to others. And it's easy to just read that as sort of a one-off, as arrogance. But I think in this text it means something a little bit more than that. It's more of an ideal. It's an ideal that one of the commentaries that I read this week as I was working on this sermon, and it talks about using as a contrast between super-mindedness and sober-mindedness. And we might all have different gifts from each other, and in a minute we'll talk more about how that's special and important. But we shouldn't presume that with our skill we can be some sort of superhero or a tyrant. That somehow all the things that we are, all the things that we're paying attention to, that all of that now somehow makes us better than everybody else. That's not quite what Paul's getting at. Ideally, what we can do is we bring our best sober judgment that we're paying attention to in this world. We offer it to others strongly and honestly. We might be serious. We might be self-controlled, but we don't use that over someone. We also expect others to do the same. And why this is important is this is part of the culture that Paul is steeped in. Paul is steeped in these Greco-Roman ideals. If you remember in Acts, when Paul goes up to Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and he sees all of these statues around him, and he seems like he's really angry, and then he finds one to an unknown god, and he says, people of Mars Hill, I see that you're religious people. You even have a statue to an unknown god. While Paul was angry and furious, he began to look around, and he said, you know what, I think I can explain this. So it wasn't this high-mindedness, this super-mindedness, this superhero-ness, but instead it was the solid understanding of what was going on. And this is what Paul is talking about as he thinks about the Greco-Roman ideals. If any of you remember your early world history, you can remember the idea of the polis, the city-state, the place where all decisions were made together and people debated together and they came up with different ideas, and it was such like a fun, maybe fun, I don't know, I wasn't there, but for me, it seems kind of fun to sit with a bunch of people and sober-minded reflection and debate about the good things in the world. That's what Paul wants us to do as well, because that's what Paul is steeped in, and he's trying to contrast against an overly emotional, high-minded, superhero, tyrannical form of thinking, as if it's like, do you know what? You have to believe in God in this specific way at this specific time, or otherwise you're not doing your job. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't have deep convictions. But I think Paul invites us to have sober-minded discussion and debate. So Paul invites us first to reestablish our intellect to prove God's will, to think hard. Paul also invites us to keep calm and carry on, to pay attention to what's going on, to be willing to offer it in a sober-minded perspective. And then finally, Paul reminds us that we also each have a role. Paul reminds us that we've each been set aside to do certain things. Now, it doesn't mean that we get overly excited when we have some gift or someone has another, that maybe you're particularly good at something, and this other person, it doesn't seem as important. Well, that actually is important. And so bringing all of this together in a sort of sober-minded reflection of what's going on in the world might be the way that we are transformed, that we repattern ourselves, that we have thoughtful discussion with each other. We say, maybe this is a better way of doing things. And in our gospel, Peter gives us example of how this works. Now keep in mind, this is the same Peter who bumbles around all the time, who a couple weeks ago was trying to walk on water and stumbled all over himself and nearly drowned, and Jesus had to save him. This is a guy who, in just a short period of time, we will be reminded that he denies Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. This is the guy that you're kind of like, do I want to be like him? Not exactly the definition of sober-minded to me as portrayed in the Gospels, but even so, he's counting the evidence in his own mind. He's counting the evidence in his own mind against the world, and he's repattering He's counting the evidence in his own mind against the world, and he's beginning to repattern himself. And even in his assessment of Jesus, if you look at the text, it wasn't some sort of super excited exclamation, but it was a sober-minded assessment of who Jesus is. Well, what does the world think I am? Take your pick. Well, who do you think I am? Well, Jesus, I think you're the Messiah. And in that, Peter becomes the person that he's called to be. God invites him to be the rock of the church. Petra. Peter, the rock. Peter was called to lead the church. And that doesn't mean that the other disciples were worthless. No, I mean, they all were there. They had their role. They had their gifts. But it also doesn't mean that Peter didn't have a particular calling either. In spite of his bumbling, in spite of his imperfections. His sober-minded judgment of what was going on helped him to repattern himself. Or maybe, more appropriately, that my gosh, y'all, I'm struggling to say repattern. But that repatterning opened him up to what God had called him to all along. So how do we live this? As we've watched 2020 progress, I think that this has become a time that is just rife with the desires to either conform to or to be so super-minded that we neglect sober-mindedness. Every Facebook fight about something related to COVID, every Twitter argument that's related to something political, and every single time there is some sort of QAnon post, every conspiracy theory, every single thing that comes up and we think this is the answer. We overwhelm ourselves and maybe we stop thinking sober-mindedly, but instead we think super-mindedly, that somehow we are so much smarter than everybody else that we can see right through it. Every single time it starts to add up. And we abandon the idea of thinking sober-mindedly, of finding the evidence of where God actually is. But what might it be like to seek God more sober-mindedly? It might actually mean that we just do the thing we've always done. It might mean that maybe you're good at singing. Maybe you keep singing. Maybe you're just really thoughtful. You pay attention to others. Maybe you're somebody who has a strong prophetic voice about what isn't right in the world and what is not just, so you continue to speak it. Maybe you don't do it in the way that everybody else is doing, but you do it in a way that helps remind others to also seek God with their minds. It may be living into what makes us who we are more honestly. I mean, sure, it's fun to let our imaginations go wild with every single conspiracy theory that is out there. I mean, I still don't know where Jimmy Hoffa is. Well, my best guess is the moon landing actually happened. It might be fun to think that it doesn't happen. And Area 51 could still have aliens. And wouldn't it be hilarious if it was the aliens' fault that this all happened in 2020? I don't know. If I see that on Twitter in a couple weeks, I'll know it's my fault. And sorry about that. Yeah, sure, this might be fun, but is it honest? Is it real? Is it what actually is going on? Is it the things that we can use our minds and test against and see what's going on in the world? Probably not. I'd like to think God is still a God that offers enough in this world that we can find God through our minds. And honestly, watching the progress that so many great doctors have made and so many researchers have made in finding a vaccine for COVID would make me believe that God still values our intellect. God still values our ability to think. It may mean, in the end, that we're offering everything that we are. Our minds, our bodies, our souls, and our spirits as a full and living offering to God. That we just don't sit and hope that our hearts, if we feel hard enough for God, that that's enough. That if we think that it's just our spirits that are enough, if we just release ourselves to God enough, that will be all of it. That somehow, if we do that stuff, that will mean that we repattern ourselves in order to actually be able to follow God. It means all of it. Even the side that we might tend to neglect. But it is that mind, along with the body, soul, and spirit, that we give to God in all we are, that might be the thing to renew us, even in a difficult time. Thanks be to God for our minds and the chance to seek God in a sober-minded way.